Mr. Murray's name on the spine.
Indeed, so, Chair.
That were there
Yes,
as
however,
recently as last night. So I don't understand why anybody says to you they couldn't locate them. They were together. But it's okay. You have improvised. But they certainly were there, both of them, last night. And I think they were given to the protectors this morning. But it's okay. Let's proceed.
thank you, Chair.
Yeah,
Chair,
it's not your fault.
Thank you, Chair. The statement, or rather report by Mr. Maria appears from page 10, and it goes all the way until page 29 of the paginated bundle.
And he had begun to give evidence on the report last
Indeed,
time.
so, Chair.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to remind the Chair of the context of Mr. Maria's evidence. Mr. Maria's report was drafted from his independent review of 3 documents that were provided to him by ENS through its investigation. And his terms of reference in line with that review was firstly to determine the reasonableness of the costs quoted in the documents, secondly, whether there was or would be any benefit for government in the project, thus the value for money spent or invested, and lastly, any other concerns regarding the feasibility or sustainability of the project. Mr. Murray, where we last ended in your evidence was at page 35 of the paginated bundle. And there you had already started dealing with the first document, which is the project proposal. And you had explained to the Chair how that table is set out and what you sought to put forth in your report through that table. Please speak. The record won't pick up your notes.
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. So you had dealt with the first 4 items of that table, being the preamble, the proposed start flagship project, what you have called the second paragraph, and fourthly, what you had referred to as table 1. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
The next item that appears there is the detailed project costing. And Chair, we are on page 16 of Mr. Maria's report. Just to remind the Chair, the project proposal...
You talked about page 35, and I'm at page 35. That's not where you are.
Page 35 is the document that was under review. That is the project proposal. So we will be continuing from page 35. However, in Mr. Maria's report, we are at page 16.
Is page 35 not part of his report?
No, Chair. Mr. Maria, pardon me, his report starts from page 10 all the way until page 29. And the documents that he had to review start from page 30 all the way until the end of the bundle.
Oh, okay, all right. So 35 is fine, but you are saying that we get to 35 as a result of what is in at page 16.
Indeed, so, Chair.
Yeah, okay, all right. So you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Murray, just to remind the Chair, the project proposal, which was under review, is dated the 15th of May 2012. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Now, in your table at page 16 of your report, you deal with your findings in respect of the detailed project costing. Please take the Chair through your findings in this respect.
Chair, yeah, if we can start then at the fifth part, which is the detailed project costing, as we've covered the previous 4 in my previous testimony. I think if we look at the detailed project costing, and that's where page 35 come in, the comment there is that the dairy cattle is being budgeted for at 25,000 Rand per cow in milk, as well as for the followers. Given the amount, it was at that stage in 2012, 2013, it was fairly high, as commercial cows, dairy cows at that stage was valued at more or less 15,000 rand per cow in milk, while followers was much, well, not much cheaper, but it was around about 13,000 rand for a follower.
What is the reference to followers
Chair,
referring to?
Yeah, Chair, follower is a cow, a dry cow, or a heifer that still needs to come in milk. So they are not currently in milk.
Oh, okay, okay. So you say at that time, the normal price would have been 15,000 rand per cow.
Per cow in milk,
Or
Chair.
follower.
For a cow in milk,
Yeah.
15,000, and a follower was roughly 12 to 13,000.
Okay, okay. So 25,000 rand was way above the norm.
Substantially above the norm, Chair.
Yes.
Yes.
And you could find no justification for that.
No, sir.
Okay.
And you then continue to give your analysis of the milking parlor in your report. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Please take
So-
the chair through those findings.
So the milking parlor was budgeted for 5 million rand. The assumption is made that it's only the machinery of the milking parlor and not the building and the infrastructure around that specific milking parlor. If we turn around to page 17 then and continue with the table, apart from that 5 million rand that is budgeted for the milking parlor, a further 15 million rand was budgeted for under the heading Other Dairy Equipment. Now, unfortunately, there is no detail around these other dairy equipment that could be investigated to see what that entails. So for a investment of 15 million rand, a very state-of-the-art dairy parlor could have been implemented at that stage.
If I can just take you back to page 16 of your report, where you make reference to the milking parlor as being costed at 5 million. You say there it is assumed to be only for machinery.
That's correct.
On what basis have you made that assumption?
Well, there's no detail set out in the detailed project costing, which is found on page 35, that one can say it is part of the buildings is included in that heading under milking parlor.
And would the amount of 5 million be appropriate for a milking parlor?
Well, for the machinery, definitely. But if you include that added dairy equipment of 15 million, it's way above the norm.
So 5 million rand would have been reasonable for the machinery.
For the machinery, yes, Chair.
But the additional 15 million rand, you say there was no justification you could find for that.
That's correct, Chair. Since there's no detail of what that all entails, because if you look at the other parts, you've already see the bulk cooling tanks, which is also part of the dairy equipment, and then there's no detail given in the project costings or in the other documentation what these equipment will entails.
Of course, I think one would expect that there would be proper details provided for setting aside 15 million rand. That's quite a lot of money.
Chair, I agree with you. If we look at the feasibility plan, for example, and that's one of my comments later on, there's very little detail of all these equipment and information. So it's quite difficult to do a proper assessment of the value of those.
Because I guess the feasibility, study must tell you whether, among other things, you are going to get value for money, and whether you are going to be wasting money on something that that you could get for less. Am I right?
That's correct, Chair.
Yeah. So if you set aside 15 million rand, I guess the feasibility study should tell you what that would be for and give you the details.
That's correct, Chair. I would have expected for a 15 million line item, there would have been more detail provided in either of the three documents.
Yes.
But unfortunately, it's not in this case.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, I'm trying to reconcile your analysis insofar as the 5 million and what you have stated on page 17 of your report in respect of the 15 million. Because you state there that for an investment of 15 million, a state-of-the-art high-precision parlor can be erected. Now, what would be the appropriateness of the 15 million rands quoted in light of what you've stated there?
Chair, it's difficult to ascertain which amount would have been the most appropriate one, as there is no detail. The assumption was made that it's only the 5 million for the machinery, and then the other dairy equipment, and that's where we lack detail in the documents to give a proper assessment. And the assumption is made that, should you spend 15 million on dairy equipment, it would have been a very, very high precision operation that could be erected.
I take it that that doesn't detract from what you said earlier, that if you have set aside 5 million rand for the machinery, really, then it's difficult to understand what the 15 million rand would be for.
That's correct, Chair, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Pardon me, thank you, Chair. Then the next item that you deal with in the project proposal is the business model. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair. So the business, according to the business model in the document that was reviewed, Estina was planning to fund the project, but they requested government to commit a certain number of, or a certain amount of grants to make the project commercially sustainable and viable.
Mr. Murray, for this purpose, I will need us to turn to the actual paragraph that deals with the business model. I have it as appearing at page 36 under paragraph 6 of that document. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
I'm going to request you, before dealing with your analysis in that respect, to read that very short paragraph, and you will then continue to provide your analysis.
The complete paragraph, Chair.
Yes, paragraph
Okay.
6 that deals with the business model, please.
So, business model, in line with the Agri-BEE business norms stipulated by government, Estina proposes that a new special purpose vehicle, or a SPV, be created in which Estina will hold a 49% share, while the remaining 51% shares will be distributed to at least 3 selected grant recipients. Estina will provide the required capital injection as well as the technical know-how which will be provided by Paras. Estina will endeavor to fund the entire project itself and is requesting the government to commit to an annual grant of 100 million rand per year for 5 years to ensure that the project remains sustainable and commercially viable.
Yes.
End of paragraph.
Thank you. Now, in that paragraph, at the latter part of that paragraph, 2 things are said. Firstly, it is stated that Estina will endeavor to fund the project in its entirety by themselves. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's how I
But then in
understand
the
the
same
paragraph.
breath, the sentence continues to say that a grant will be required from the Department of Agriculture.
That's correct.
Are you able to reconcile those 2 statements?
Not at all, and hence my comment that if a project is commercially viable and sustainable, why would you request government to put grants into that? So that's not a reconcilable comment for me, that paragraph.
But also, this project was meant to be, was it meant to be 3 years or 5 years? I'm trying to remember now.
Chair,
I see they talk about 5 years, 100 million rand over five-year period here. Are you able to recall?
Chair, from my previous witness 2 weeks ago, so there was 2 project proposals. and that's on page 16 of my report as well. So there was in one instance, they requested 500 million, so it's 100 million for 5 years. And in the second project proposal, which, if I remember correctly, is the signed version of that, they requested a total amount of 342 million in grants, which is 114 rand over 3 years. So there's already a disparity or the discrepancy between the two project proposals as well.
So you end up not knowing whether it's meant for 3 years or for 5 years.
That's correct, Chair.
Yeah, but in regard to 5 years, they certainly want the government to pay 100 million, to commit itself to 100 million rand for each one of those 5 years.
That's correct, Chair.
Despite the fact that they say they will...
They would fund it in its entirety, yes.
Yes.
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you.
Yes, and just for the sake of the record, those two periods of the contract, Chair, appear firstly in the first project proposal at page 35. And there it is stated that the grants of 100 million per year for 5 years at the bottom of that document, Chair, would be 500,000. And in the second project proposal, the term of 3 years appears on page 43. And we do apologize, Chair, it's a very bad copy. Don't think we could get a better copy, but Mr. Murray has previously given evidence to the extent that it was a grant of 114 million for a period of 3 years, that amounting to 342
this
million.
One at page 43, you can hardly read what's there. You can read maybe some lines, but attempts will be made to get a better copy.
Indeed so, Chair.
Okay,
But
yes.
the reference to the term of 3 years and the amount appears at the very last row of that table.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Murray, you were still telling the Chair about the apparent contradiction at page 36 of the bundle insofar as the business model. And you were completing your analysis in your review in that respect.
Chair, yes, as I've said, it doesn't make business sense that if a project is commercially viable without grants and profitable in year one, as I've said later on in that paragraph, why will it be necessary then to receive grants from government? And hence my comment that it doesn't make sense.
Well, it stated how much will be asked for from government for each of the 5 years, but was it stated how much Estina would commit itself to paying for each one of those years?
Chair, just according to the two project proposals that I received, in the one it was 500 million, and in the second one it was 228 million, while government in the first one was an equal amount of 500 million, and in the second project proposal, government's contribution was 342 million compared to Estina's 228 million.
In regard to the 3-year proposal, government would pay about 342 million, and how much would Estina pay?
228 million, Chair.
And in regard to the 5-year, the government would pay 500 million, and how much would Estina pay?
500 million, Chair.
Now, how does paying 200 and something on the part of Estina in over 3 years, when government will pay 342 million for the same period, how does that? How does one reconcile that with the idea which is mentioned here that Estina would try and fund it on its own?
Chair, I couldn't find any argument to reconcile them, and hence my comment on page 17 in the conclusion, where I stated the funding difference in the proposals is inexplicable. In either case, however, it raises concerns that government's funding is expected to be higher in one proposal than the other. And it's not clear which one is the latest one between those two proposals.
Did you get the impression when you were looking at this to carry out your mandate, did you get the impression that the feasibility study was done in a haphazard way and there was no proper application of minds? Or did you get the impression that it was done by somebody who didn't understand what they were doing, or both?
Chair, I got the impression that it was rather a desktop feasibility study and project proposals being drafted to get funding, first of all. Because if we look later on at the feasibility study, you would see it's a very academic piece of work and doesn't entail everything that needs to be included into a feasibility study. So I got the impression that it was, as you said, haphazard perhaps, but also a very time constraint and done quickly just to get it over and done with. And definitely not done by somebody who has knowledge of the dairy industry in South Africa.
When you got involved to carry out the mandate that you were given, was it your understanding that by that time, was it your understanding that this feasibility study had been approved by the Department of Agriculture?
Chair, I was actually under an impression that they still want to invest in this project, and that's, I think, one of my concluding remarks, which I said that the feasibility and study and everything should be redone and revisited. I wasn't under the impression that it was already implemented.
Thank you.
Perhaps if you would just confirm, Mr. Murray, you were provided with 3 documents. Firstly, the project proposal, secondly, the business plan, and thirdly, the feasibility study. And we are still dealing with the first project, the first document being the project proposal, and then the 2 other documents, the business plan and feasibility study, will follow, where you'll give the Chair more detail, particularly in respect of the feasibility study.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
I may have confused him.
Well, I just needed to clarify where we are, Chair.
Yes, okay, all right. No, that's
Thank
fine.
you, Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
But the comments you made, would they apply to the first document that we are still talking about?
Chair, my comments regarding the way in which it was done, I think apply to all 3 of them.
Yes, okay, thank
And you
you.
say that much in your conclusion, which we'll get to. The next item that appears in the project proposal, which you have, however, not addressed in your report, is at page 36, and it appears at paragraph 7. That item is entitled Optimizing the Development Potential of this Flagship Project. As stated, I note that you haven't addressed yourself to this topic, but I will nonetheless request you to comment on this topic. In the opening line of that paragraph, it is stated there, and if the Chair will allow me to quote, "It is envisaged that the STARD integrated agribusiness project will become a center of excellence for the entire Free State and even the neighboring provinces." Do you have any comment in this respect, given the evidence that you've probably given to the Chair, and also with particular reference to the history of the Free State, as you had previously articulated to the Chair?
Chair, yes. I think if the project was implemented and it was a flagship project as it was envisaged, I think it could have become a center of excellence. I think we in South Africa lack a lot of practical agricultural training. So it could have become such a center of excellence. But given the fact that dairy production in the Free State was declining and still is declining, it wouldn't make sense to do it in Vrede. I would rather do it in a province that is more suitable for milk production as such.
Now, that particular heading at the second paragraph continues to say, from the second paragraph, eventually this project will provide, and the first bullet point says, on-site, in-service practical agricultural training for aspirant farmers to equip them for the profitable operation and management for their own DOD projects, albeit first hyphen, primary production of livestock and agricultural produce, or second hyphen, value adding and beneficiation to livestock and agricultural produce. Second bullet point says basic business, financial, and management skills training and in-service application. And overleaf at page 37, the last bullet point says cooperative processing, value adding, and beneficiation of livestock and agricultural produce for all DOT projects in the Free State. Are you able to comment on that second paragraph as set out in the project proposal?
Chair, I wouldn't be able to comment on that specifically. As I've said, I think should it have been a flagship project, it would have been a very good addition to agricultural development in South Africa. Unfortunately, we now know it's not the case.
The last aspect under that heading on page 37, and again I quote, it says, cooperative marketing facilities into the major consumer markets of South and Southern Africa for all DOT project in the Free State, thus creating the necessary critical mass and economies of scale, which will unlock additional financial benefit for all DOT project participants. Are you able to comment on that paragraph?
Chair, unfortunately as well not. I think with regards to the marketing, cooperative marketing issue, it was somewhat addressed in my comments regarding the feasibility study later on in my report.
Yes, that's fine. If we then return to your report at page 17 of the bundle, the last item in the project proposal which you deal with is entitled The Need for the Dairy Project.
That's correct, Chair.
And if we turn to page 37 of the project proposal, there are 3 bullet points which are stated in support of the need for the chosen dairy project. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it would be that topic that you addressed yourself to.
That's correct, Chair.
For the sake of understanding your analysis in this respect, I know it's about half a page, but this is one of the critical issues that this commission is considering, being the need for the dairy project itself, and this is in light of where it was located and so forth. I'm going to request you to please read what is stated in the project proposal as being the need for the chosen dairy project.
So the need for a chosen dairy project, it can be concluded that there is an urgent need for this project based on the following facts. Bullet 1, the sale of milk provides extra income on a regular basis to rural people who often have just enough to get by. Milk sales also improve the nutritional status of rural population, though not necessarily the urban needy. Milk is also one of the few agricultural products that can be supplied and marketed regularly by non-land owners. A dairy plant creates jobs in rural areas and thus helps check urban migration. Second bullet point, milk and milk products are thought of as staple foods in Europe. Favorable production conditions means that everyone can consume large amounts of milk and dairy products. For many of the world's peoples, however, even though milk plays no role in the diet, if balanced food is available in sufficient quantities, neither health nor welfare should be affected by the lack of milk. Recommended third world dairy policies fall somewhere between these two extremes. Milk protein can enhance plant protein, and in a diet combining several foods, a compensatory balance is established among the various sources of proteins. Animal proteins supply essential amino acids. Plant proteins can then economically top up the total supply. The third bullet point, many third world countries find it hard to right the balance of payments. Imported dairy products are one of the foreign exchange savings which can be affected by a dairy development policy. Moreover, international prices may go up in the medium or long run, placing a country which is not in a position to partially substitute imports by local production at a disadvantage. End of the paragraph.
So all of those three bullet points flow from what is cited just under the topic, the need for the chosen dairy project. It stated there, it can be concluded that there is an urgent need for this project based on the following facts, and then it enlists those three bullet points that you've taken the chair through. Now, as I have it, and as I have observed from your report, there are three main issues there. Firstly, it would be extra income. Secondly, it would be nutritional value. And thirdly, would be that foreign exchange savings component. What is your finding in respect of all 3 points that are made there?
Chair, first of all, I think in terms of the extra income to the rural population, it's definitely true in certain African countries. However, that is small-scale dairy production. I've said, you'll find that on page 17, for example, in Zambia, that is successful. There is not, at this stage, successful small-scale dairy farming in South Africa, given the economies of scale and various other reasons. So, to say it's it would be an extra income to rural people, I think it's a bit of a wish list in terms of that first point. I think we've also addressed some of the comments regarding the job creation in my previous testimony regarding the 600 people for a dairy plant. So that's with regards to the first bullet point. I think with regards to the second bullet point, it stated there that milk is a staple food in Europe. We're living in Africa, and milk is not a staple food, definitely not in South Africa at this stage. So there's already, for me, a disparity between what the need for this project or saying and where we are living at this stage. Unfortunately, and I'm not a dietitian or a health practitioner, but there is a problem with lactose intolerance under certain parts of our population. So, and that's one of the reasons why milk or milk consumption, fresh milk consumption is not that high in Africa as it is in Europe. In terms of the foreign exchange savings, that's definitely a positive, as we import a lot of milk powder, cheese, and UHT milk at this stage. So that's one positive that one can take out of this need for this specific project.
But you see, the most important point is there anything in those reasons that are given there that says why government should be involved in this project?
There's none in those three reasons.
Because any private person, any private company can embark on whatever business they want to embark upon. It's their own money, and they can do their own feasibility study, or proposals. That's their own business. They can make whatever decisions. But here, this proposal contemplates that government must spend money. And I would have expected that the proposal would provide justification as to why government should spend money or should be involved in this kind of thing. So, and out of these three reasons here, I really don't see anything that says here is why government should be involved in this.
Chair, I agree 100% with you, and definitely not an urgent need, as is stated in the beginning of that paragraph.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
With reference to, and we'll be closing on the need for the chosen dairy project, with reference to milk and milk products being thought as staple foods in Europe, do you think that this could have possibly been a copy and paste assessment?
Chair, I definitely think so, yes.
Okay. You then set out in page...
Chair, sorry, Councillor. Chair, to add to that, the fact that it says favourable production conditions also tell me that it can be a copy and paste from a European or another document.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you then set out your conclusion on this document, being the project proposal, as appears at page 17 of your report. Please take the Chair through your conclusion in this respect.
Chair, yes, if I can conclude on this project proposals. First of all, I think the funding differences between the two documents that I reviewed, as I've said, is inexplicable. It's not sure which one was then in the end accepted. In addition to that, if a project is commercially viable, why would a government be needed to fund that specific project? I think that's the two points that stands out for me. And then in my last paragraph on page 17, I think the need for a dairy project is not disputed. However, it can be concluded that some of the project costs...
Yes, the need for a product might not be disputed, but is the need for involvement of a government in a dairy project also not disputed?
No, Chair, that is disputed. I wouldn't say government should be involved in a commercially dairy project.
Yes, okay.
Some of the costs of this project is definitely unreasonably high. I think, first of all, and that includes the cow prices and certain equipment. If the latter is the case, the principal should actually do an in-depth cost-benefit analysis on the impact of the proposed project in that region. I don't think there was definitely not an in-depth cost-benefit analysis done on the Frederick Dairy project.
And I take it that to the extent that you said the idea of a dairy project may have been a good idea, but how they went about it is something else. To the extent that you said that, must one understand that remark on your part to be confined to simply a commercial project, and not necessarily that you are saying that the involvement of government may also have been a good idea as long as it was done properly? Is that something that you are using that remark to apply to as well, or just simply the idea of a dairy project?
Chair, no, at this stage I was simply referring to the dairy project itself.
Yes.
And since it's going to be a commercial project,
yes,
government involvement in that.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Still on page 17 of your report at the conclusion, on the last paragraph on that page, you've already taken the Chair through your comments insofar as the need for the dairy project. You also say that an in-depth cost analysis should, on the impact of the proposed project in the region, should be undertaken. Are you able to say what expertise, if any, would be required for an in-depth cost analysis?
Chair, I would definitely think a agricultural economist, but you will also include certain special expertise in certain fields. You'll definitely include an agronomist, animal scientist with feeding specialities, because dairy production is highly intensive with regards to feeding. You will definitely include a marketer or somebody who have in-depth knowledge of the dairy market, because it's definitely a difficult market in South Africa, and then definitely also somebody with processing knowledge on the processing side.
Then still on that paragraph, the last sentence on that page, you state there that a project of this nature does not always benefit the local economy 100%. Firstly, when you say local economy, would you be referring to the Free State specifically?
Chair, I would there refer to the specific district, in this case the Vrede district, but you can actually make that bigger to the Free State economy as well.
And when you say that it does not always benefit the local economy 100%, are you able to elaborate on that statement?
Chair, yes, if you look at the dairy industry, a lot of the equipment and most of the equipment actually is being imported from either European countries or New Zealand and Australia, for example. So when you put up a processing plant and a dairy parlor, there's a lot of equipment that goes into that, stainless steel and so forth. And obviously when you purchase that, the money doesn't necessarily go into the local economy. It goes to the companies, and in most cases that is international companies. So you can't say it benefits the local economy at 100%.
Yes. The next document that you then deal with is the business plan. And that document, Chair, appears from page 47 until 56 of the bundle. And you set out your findings in your report from page 18 of your report.
That's correct, Chair.
If we turn to page 48 of the paginated bundle, and I hope you'll be able to see this is also not such illegible.
Okay, I've got page 18 and I've got page 47.
Thank you, Chair. Page 47 is where the business plan starts, and it carries on until page 56.
Yes.
Page 18 of the report is where Mr. Murray provides his analysis.
Yes, okay.
If we turn over
And I
leaf...
got all the pages I need to have.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, all right.
If we turn over leaf to page 48,
Yes.
that is the first page of the business plan.
Okay.
Are you there, Mr. Murray?
I'm there, Chair.
On the second paragraph, it's actually the third paragraph, and again, I'm going to have to ask you to read this, that sentence that starts with establishing a modern confinement, as I'm going to request your comment thereon. Can you please read that paragraph?
Chair, I'll try my best. Establishing a modern confinement dairy offers nearby crop producers the opportunity to create a profitable new business that can also increase the profitability of their existing cropping operations. By marketing their crops through a dairy, grain and silage producers can improve their margins while profitably producing a valuable commodity that is increasingly in short supply in the Free State.
Yes, thank you. Now, having read that, what is your understanding insofar as the grain and silage production?
Chair, my understanding from that paragraph is that a project like it is envisaged here, which is a confined dairy operation, what we call a TMR, or totally mixed ration dairy, that creates opportunities for grain producers to supply the dairy with either finished grain or maize, or otherwise silage as a feed to the cows in the dairy.
So would I be of the correct understanding that the grain and silage production would be outsourced?
From this paragraph, I would gather that as well, yes, Chair.
Okay, you deal with this in detail, particularly with the machinery that is used in grain and silage production when you deal with the feasibility study, and we will come back to this point. If we can then return to the business plan, still on page 48 of that business plan. The last paragraph that appears on that page speaks to mitigation of risks. Can you please take the chair through?
Before you proceed, just in case it's something we haven't said, I haven't said, it looks like many of the pages on this file or documents need to get better copies for them. If you can, I mean, some you might find that it might be possible for somebody to retype them, because if you pay close attention, you can retype, but where you can get copies, let's get copies. They are not satisfactory. So if that can be done.
That will be done, Chair. We had
relied
on the copies as used by Mr. Murray, because I think that's, if I recall, that's one of the limitations that he encountered insofar as his review being the legibility of the copies he received. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Murray, still on page 48 of the business plan. The last paragraph on that page speaks to mitigation of risk factors as identified in that paragraph. Can you go through that paragraph and then tell the Chair, in your view, whether the risks would be mitigated as is proposed in that paragraph?
Chair, yes, they proposed, or they said, that a large-scale dairy operation is under threat of a number of risks, and those risks can be mitigated by the deployment of a highly skilled management team. That, in part, I think is true. However, there is some risks that can't be mitigated by only a management team. For example, the economies of scale is pertinent in TMR-based dairy systems in South Africa. You have to be bigger or you get out. Secondly, climate and weather conditions. It doesn't matter what type of management skill you have. Those type of situations you can't always 100% mitigate. You have to rely on certain instruments as well. So if you look at, they've said also they envisaged a number of integration and other activities, as well as downstream value adding and beneficiation. Now that in part is true to add value to your product, to not only sell a commodity like milk, but if you add value and you make, for example, milk powder or cheese or yogurt and so forth, you can definitely mitigate certain market risks, although you are then under other market risks as well.
And if we turn to page 49 of the business plan, the second last paragraph, which starts with, in the short term, also addresses, or rather proposes, another means of mitigation of risks. Can you please take the Chair through what is set out there, as well as your view in this respect?
Chair, yes, in that regard, they will start off by procure milk from in-house rearing and milking cows, in-house. But then it was envisaged that the operation will be gradually expanded to include local farmers in the area. In that way, they would mitigate the risk of to have too little milk in the processing plant, for example. Now, if we take into account that the number of local farmers have diminished substantially in that district, it would have been a much bigger risk to source your milk from other producers around you.
Yes, and as I read the business plan, those are the only two areas where the mitigation of risks are identified, unless you've come across any other means of mitigation of risk.
No, Chair.
And do you think that what is set out in the business plan, insofar as mitigating risks, would suffice in identifying not only the risks that are inherent in a dairy project, but also means and ways of mitigating such risks?
Chair, no, I don't think the business plan addressed that mitigation of risks.
If we then return to your report at page 18, there you set out your analysis of the business plan. Please take your chair through this analysis.
Chair, yes, the business plan, it was comprising of 6 pages plus 3 additional pages, which is the seem to be Excel sheets, which is very unreadable in certain cases. But my first bullet point, if we look at a well-planned dairy, it definitely represents a number of opportunities in terms of value addition and beneficiation, which is in favor of this type of project when it's planned and implemented in a good way. As it is indicated in the project proposal, the dairy cows have definitely been over budgeted for, the 25,000 versus the 15,000 rand. My third comment on the business plan, it's unclear why provision was made for a feedlot if the plan was to sell the cull cows and the male culls, which can be seen as sales and income on page 5 and 6 of the specific business plan. Except if the plan was to finish them off in a feedlot, then it might be necessary. But it is not well defined in the business plan what was the plan for the cull cows. The assumption of the average milk per cow per day of 45 litres is unrealistic. If we take into account at that stage the national average production per cow per day was only 20.1 litres. And if you have very good conditions with excellent management, cows in general will produce between 30 and 38 litres per day.
And just before you proceed, what would constitute good conditions apart from an excellent management team?
Chair, it will be a cool environment, no heat stress on the cow, a well feeding regime, so a feeding plan with a ration that's developed for optimal production. In terms of intensive dairy production, the cow mustn't move too much around, doesn't have stress and those type of unnecessary conditions. And obviously also healthy cows would be part of that.
So if the national average was 20, then it looks like 45 was way beyond what could reasonably be expected.
Just to put a national average in perspective there, so the national average would be an average across total mixed ration and pasture-based systems. So under a pasture-based system, like we have in the Midlands and the Eastern Cape coastal areas, average production per cow is roughly between 18 and 22 litres per cow, because the cows walk a lot to the feed and so forth. Under TMR-based situations or feeding regimes, where the cow is in housing, the top producers at that stage was just averaging 38 litres per day. And that's only for the top producing cows as well. So 45 litres per cow per day is definitely unrealistic.
But was there an indication as to what the basis was for choosing 45?
There was no indication, Chair.
Did it sound like it was just a thumbs up?
Chair, I think it was being done by a person that's not well known to the dairy industry, and just take a number of a specific cow at some stage that could produce, because there is cows that can produce 45 litres per day, but that would not be across a total.
That would not be the norm.
That would not be the norm, Chair.
Yes. But also in a business plan, I would have thought that things would be properly motivated to show that the plan is a viable plan.
I definitely agree, Chair.
Thank you.
And insofar as the anticipated financial performance, according to the business plan, that appears from page 52 all the way until page 56 of the paginated pages. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And you have taken the Chair through your analysis of the components on financial performance. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
You have also referred to, in your report, to the sales and income.
Yeah.
And as I have it, that appears at the bottom of page 52.
That's correct.
Can you take the Chair through what is stated there insofar as the sales and income as provided for in the business plan?
Chair, yeah, so they've said in short that they will start producing milk from April, May 2013. So it was estimated to be conservatively for only 9 months. And then from 2014-15 onwards, it would be a full year of production. So they estimated a total sale income from milk to the extent of 66.31 million for a total year. And then it is likely to be increased by 10% per year by adding 50 additional cows from 2016-17 onwards. They've also made provision of on the sales and income, sales proceeds from extra agricultural produce. And that would be maize, soybeans, hay, etc. As well as, in this case, milking cows that's being replaced on a regular basis, as well as the calves that's being sold.
And what is your view insofar as the projected sales and income as set out in the business plan?
Chair, they've made the assumptions on the income and the sales based on 45 litres per cow per day, which, as we've discussed, is extremely high and unsustainable and not reasonable. So that means that all the numbers and income numbers that's been envisaged is actually incorrect then, and overstated in my opinion.
Then if we turn to the following page, page 53, from the top of that page, a topic entitled Net Profit is provided for. Please take the Chair through what is stated insofar as what was the anticipated net profit as has been stated there.
So, Chair, that they said that it would take roughly 12 to 14 months for a dairy to become operational, and that will result in a loss of 8.48 million for 2012-2013, and then only 1.83 million in 2013-14. However, they said if they have backward integration due to availability of land, the expense on animal feed will be very low. Further agricultural production is likely to be more than a requirement for animal feed. So that implies that they will sell off the maize and soybeans that's not being used in the dairy. They will sell then on the market. So it's likely to generate additional income that to increase the profitability. So the company has not forecasted any dividend during the currency of bank finance, which I'm not sure where that comes in, and the EBIT sales hovering around 70%, and PBT to sales is always more than 40%, which reflects a healthy profitability.
Now, before I put a question on this, just after they set out the backward integration plan, as is stated there, it further goes on to say that, however, we have not considered it. What is your understanding of that statement?
Chair, I understand that it's the plan, but they're actually not considering implementing that. As it's stated earlier in the documents, they would actually prefer, or they will actually procure maize or grains from the local producers. and that, hence not the backward integration. However, in certain of the certain of the documents, they refer to grain production as such as being part of the dairy project.
Are you able to comment on the reasonableness of the backward integration that is proposed there, though stated to not be considered, and the effect it would have on the loss of 8.48 million in 2012-2013 and 1.83 million in 2013-2014?
Chair, it's actually difficult to comment on that on this little paragraph and the information that's not available if we look, because you actually need detailed costing and the likes of the backward integration project as well in terms of grain production. So I wouldn't make a comment on that at this stage.
Yes, you then deal with your conclusion on the business plan at page 18 of your report. Can you please take the chair through your concluding remarks of the business plan?
Chair, yeah, in conclusion, the business plan is inconsistent. In one page, they talk about a 500 cows dairy, but on the very next page, they're referring to 100 cows in milk.
1,000, isn't it?
Sorry, Chair?
1,000, is it not 1,000? I think you said 100. 100.
1,000, Chair.
Yes.
Apologies. So one page 500 and the very next page 1,000 cows in milk. So in addition to that, many of the initial assumptions is very unrealistic and it would be difficult to attain those numbers, specifically referring to the 45 litres per cow average per day. It can therefore be concluded that the business plan is not realistic and should be revisited.
I mean, a business that will involve, a dairy business that will involve 500 milk cows and one that will involve 1,000 milk cows, that's a big difference. And that also affects the question of costs and the viability of the business would be affected by whether you are looking at 500 or 1,000, isn't it?
Definitely,
in a significant way.
Yeah, definitely. There will definitely be a significant difference in the cost, but also in the management of a project or if of a dairy of the different sizes. Management skills will definitely differ between those two.
Well, if you were presented with a business plan that has this kind of discrepancy, wouldn't any person who takes their obligations, their duties seriously, really say, take this thing away? I mean, you don't know what you're talking about. You give me, do you want a business for 500 milk cows or 1,000? You can't have properly applied your mind to this plan if you're giving me a plan that doesn't know whether you're talking about 500 or 1,000 milk cows. Wouldn't that be the normal kind of reaction, or am I too harsh?
Chair, you're definitely not too harsh. If I was the investor in this type of project, I will definitely send it back immediately.
Yes, you wouldn't want to see, once you pick that up, you wouldn't want to see anything else, because it means the person who has put it up doesn't know what they're doing.
I completely agree, Chair.
And you're talking about a business that is envisaged to involve a lot of money, and you can't get this basic right.
For sure, Chair.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Before we conclude on the business plan and move on to the last document, can I refer you to page 50 and 51 of the business plan, the paginated page 50 and 51. On page 50, there appears a table, and it is entitled Breakdown of Project Costing for the Dairy Unit and underneath that appears dairy farm costing. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
On page 51, there appears a table entitled Dairy Processing Plant Costing. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
I note that on both these tables, provision is made for dairy products manufacturing.
I'm sorry, Ms. Miller. Let's go back to page 50.
Yes, Chair.
You're drawing my attention to
Firstly, the headings of the two tables.
breakdown of project costing for the dairy units.
Yes, Chair, and the first table on page 50 is
Yes.
set to relate to dairy farm costing.
Yes, I see that.
The
And then you
second
said
table on page 51,
is dairy processing plant costing.
indeed so, Chair.
Okay, all right.
Now, I am taking Mr. Murray through some of the items in both these tables.
No, that's fine.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Murray, on page 50, just about halfway down on that table, there appears an item, dairy products manufacturing. Have you located it?
Yes, Chair, to an amount of 14 million. 14.
14 million.
That's correct.
And on page 51, the second line item is dairy products manufacturing. Is that correct?
That's correct. It
And-
looks like 46 million.
Yes, as I read it, it's 46 million.
Agree?
Before you deal with those two respective amounts, are you able to explain to the chair what the distinction between these two tables is or was purported to be?
So, Chair, my understanding is that the first one, the dairy farm costing, would be with reference to the primary dairy production. So that's the on-farm where you produce the milk. And secondly, the dairy processing plant would be your value-adding or your secondary industry. So that's the process of the raw milk that's being produced in the first project or the first part of the business. So in layman's terms, the one would be the farm, and the second one will be the manufacturing plant.
Like production of cheese and so on.
That's correct, Chair.
Yes.
Then are you able to assist with those two items on the two tables, both indicated as dairy products manufacturing? And if you, to the extent that you're able to, are you able to indicate what they would relate to in each of those tables?
So, Chair, the first one on the dairy farm costing on page 50, the dairy projects manufacturing to the value of 14 million, it doesn't make sense to have that in that specific project costing. And you can even add the next line item, the Pasteurizer, to the value of 60 million to that, because both of those two line elements is part of a manufacturing process, which actually should be in the second one, and the dairy processing plant, which is then the 46 million. So it seems to me, first of all, that the dairy project manufacturing is included in the primary production side, which in my view is a mistake, and then it should be included in the second one. Unfortunately, what it entails is difficult to ascertain from the table that's been provided.
Would it be possible that the item referred to as dairy products manufacturing under the table dairy farm costing on page 50 would relate to purely milk production or milk processing, whereas the item also cited as dairy products manufacturing on the second table on page 51, which is entitled Dairy Processing Plant Costing, relates to the production of milk products such as cheese and the like?
So, Chair, to answer the question from the back side, in the second one, it would definitely be the product manufacturing, so cheese or powder or UHT or so forth. In the first instance, definitely not as milk production, because in that same table, just 2 rows on top of that, you have the milking parlor, which is the production of milk, the machinery for that. And hence my comment that the dairy products manufacturing line shouldn't be included in that costing.
Yes. And insofar as the pasteurizer on the first table under dairy farm costing, which has a budget value of 60 million rands, and the UHT long life milk plant on the second table, which has a budget value of 149 million rand. Are you able to speak to those 2 line items insofar as firstly where they appear and secondly what they relate to?
So, Chair, first of all, the pasteurizer shouldn't be appearing in the dairy farm costing. It should appear in the processing plant side. And secondly, the UHT milk plant is definitely at the right place. In terms of the values, I'm speaking about that in some of the further documents that's being reviewed. So perhaps I can then comment on that. So a pasteurizer would normally be a low temperature pasteurizer, where a UHT milk plant would be a high temperature pasteurizing. So it can be used in the same type of operation as well.
Then still on page 50 of the business plan, on the first table, one of the items there is a feedlot for 14 million rands, and 2 lines down is an animal feed plant for 19 million rands. Is there a difference?
Is it not 10 million for
10 million.
animal
Pardon me, Chair, it is,
feed, or even,
it is
or
10
even
million
15
rand.
million?
No.
I'm not sure
if I might assist,
which
Chair.
figure is in line with the animal feed plant.
Animal feed plant, I have it as 10 million if I read it
Yeah.
from left to right.
Okay, yeah.
And the feedlot is 14 million, as I have it. Firstly, is there a difference between those 2 line items? And if so, what is the difference?
Yes, there is a difference. The feedlot would be a feedlot, so it would be a place where the cull cows and the male calves would probably be reared, finished off for the market, and then being slaughtered from there. The animal feed plant would be a plant that produces animal feed, a mixture of grains, soybeans, maize, and so forth, which would be used in the feeding of the cows. So there is definitely a difference between the 2. It can be assumed that the animal feed plant will also produce feed for the feedlot as well.
And would the animal feed plant have to be built?
According to the costing, it would need to be built, yes. Chair.
And in your experience?
Chair, animal feed plants is very rarely built on farms, especially dairy farms. As I've said earlier, it's a specialized feeding regime for a dairy cow. So most dairy farmers, especially intensive dairy farmers, buy their feed from animal feed companies. So to put up an animal feed plant would be a very intensive operation to do. It can be value addition if you look at that, but it's very rarely the case on a dairy farm.
Yes. Then,
I'm sorry, was there an indication of why it would be necessary or justified to have it on this farm if normally it's not something that's done?
Chair, if I recollect, I couldn't find anything in any of the documents why it would be necessary. There was reference to grain production on the farm, which will be used as animal feed, but they've nowhere spoke specifically about the animal feed plant per se.
Yes.
Yes, before you deal with your conclusion on the business plan, if we turn to the cover page of the business plan at page 47, are you there?
Yes, Chair.
It is stated there, confidential business plan. Do you see that?
I see that, correct.
Having considered the business plan, are you able to comment on any aspects of the business plan which could be regarded as confidential?
Chair, most probably the only things that would be confidential would be the numbers or the tables that's been from page 54 to 56. Otherwise, I don't think there's anything else that really is confidential in this instance.
Then on page 18 of your report, you deal with your conclusion on the business plan, and you do so relative to the numbers of cows and milk that are stated in the business plan. Please take the chair through your conclusion in that respect.
Chair, yes. If we look at page 48 of the business plan, they said the production framework for a 500 cow dairy, apologies, that's in the last paragraph on that page, the second line. But if you turn over to page 49, the first bullet point, they're speaking about 1,000 cows in milk. So that's already the discrepancy in the business plan, as was indicated earlier. If you look at all the assumptions made in the business plan, it's definitely unrealistic, and it will be difficult to be attainable. So the complete business plan, in my view, is not realistic and should be revisited, or it should have been revisited.
And now this is on the letterheads of the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. So certainly one would expect that one would find something that would indicate why government should be involved in this business project of a dairy farm. And still you didn't find anything that says why government should be spending money on this business of a dairy farm.
Definitely not in the business plan, Chair.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
But you would expect that to be addressed in the business plan?
Yes, Chair, definitely. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, okay.
Is there anything else in respect of the business plan that you wish to comment upon?
Not at this stage, Chair.
Yes. And you say then in your conclusion, as you've articulated to the chair, that the business plan is not realistic, and you say that it should be revisited.
Correct, Chair.
Can we then move to the...
Or was your opinion that revisiting it was the right route, or was that a polite way of saying something more
Chair, I think
drastic? Or
I think it was more a polite way of saying that the person that drafted the business plan wasn't knowing what he was talking about.
yeah,
At the time, while I was reviewing the documents, I wasn't aware of the Freda Dairy Integrated project that is already been established and so forth.
yes,
So I went from the assumption that they still want to
yes,
invest in this project,
yes,
and hence my comment that also that it should be revisited.
yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can we then turn to page 19 of your report, where you deal with the feasibility study, which is the third and last document which you had to review?
Before we do that, let's take a 5 minutes break, and then we'll resume. We'll just adjourn for 5 minutes.
Correct, Chair.
At the very outset of your discussion of the feasibility study, you provide a general view on the feasibility study. Please take the chair through this view.
Chair, yes, in my initial comment, the first paragraph on page 19, I've stated that in general, this feasibility study is extremely academic with little detailed information on the feasibility of the project itself. It presents more as an academic manual on different issues related to dairy production, for example, haymaking and so forth, and it contains no clear information on the processing side of this project, apart from costs and some other minor assumptions.
So, I understand that to be saying it's not really a feasibility study. It's a document about a feasibility study,
Chair,
but it doesn't address real issues that would be expected in a feasibility study.
Chair,
Is that a fair understanding of what you are saying?
it's a fair understanding, Chair. It's actually not even a document about a feasibility study. It's more a document about farming and not a feasibility study in itself.
Yes, yes.
So it's not something that
So it
I
would be
would...
fair to say it's not a feasibility study at all?
Not at all, Chair.
Yes.
There's definitely elements a lot of elements that's lacking from this document to name it a feasibility study.
Okay.
Thank you. You then set out, by way of a table, your findings in respect of the feasibility study, and you do so starting with the introduction of the feasibility study. Before you deal with your findings, can you explain the Chair how one is to read that table?
Chair, yes. You should read the table as the first part of the table, the first column, starting with chapter, introduction, and so forth, as being the different chapters in the feasibility study. And then the second part of that, the comments, would be my comment on that specific chapter in the feasibility study.
Yes. And the first item that you deal with is the introduction of the feasibility study.
Chair, yes, that's correct. So in the introduction, there's already, in my comment, there's already a discrepancy again between the 500 cows in milk and the 1,000 cows in milk.
So this problem about not knowing whether the business will involve 500 milk cows or 1,000 just carries on?
It just carries on through the document, Chair.
Yes.
And followed by the introduction, you deal with chapter 1 of the feasibility study, which deals with the herd structure. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Now, in your findings, if we turn to page 60 of the paginated bundle, in the feasibility study, that is where chapter 1 appears, which deals with the herd structure.
That's correct, Chair.
Can you explain to the Chair how one is to read the structure of the herd structure, rather, as provided for in the feasibility study, in light of the herd structure as set out in your review?
So, Chair, if you look at page 19 and page 60 of the documents, I've reviewed the herd structure that was provided on page 60 according to the feasibility study. So if we can stick to that table, the table 1 in the document, the herd structure for a 500 cow dairy farm, year 1, year 2, and year 3. So you would see that you have milk cows, 300, pregnant cows, 200, and so forth, until you have adult units of 550, total units of 650. So I've compared that herd structure to an optimal herd structure, which is provided in my comments on page 19 in terms of the herd structure. So if you have if you look at page 19, you have the type of animal, then you have the optimal number of animals per 100 lactating cows, and then I've extrapolated that to 500 cows in milk and 1,000 cows in milk. So the optimal structure would be, if you have 100 cows in milk, you will have you should have 23 cows, lactating cows, which is lactating from day 1 to 100 days. Another 23 from 101 days to 200 days, and so forth, including the dry cows, the followers, as well as the heifers. So if you have 100 cows in milk, you actually should have 210 cows in your total herd. So it's your cows in milk, including your followers. So for a 500 cows in milk, you should have, and that's the second column of my comments, you should have a total herd of 1,050 cows or animals in your total herd. And henceforth also, if you have 1,000 cows in milk, you should have 2,100 animals in your total herd.
So this composition of the herd structure, are we to understand it to be static, or can there be a play around of numbers, of the composition rather, of the different cows as set out in this table?
You know, definitely there can be a play around. Obviously, the structure as set out in my comment is the optimal one. So that would be the one that gives you the optimal production over a year. While it's under normal conditions, variable conditions on any dairy farm, there will obviously be differences in the number of cows. So dairy farmers do play around with the numbers and the structure.
Are you able to say how much room one would have to maneuver insofar as the composition as of the herd structure as you've set out in this table?
Gee, there's a fair amount of room to variable room. I would say up to 15%. You must take into account that if you want continuous milk on a continuous 365 days per year, you should at least try to stick to the optimal herd structure. Otherwise, you might come at a certain period of the year when you have too little milk. In South Africa, we have a very mixed structure, while in other countries, and even certain parts of South Africa, they tend to have only seasonal production. So then the herd structure would definitely vary. But this optimal herd structure is applicable for the dairy farmers on the Highveld.
Now, the herd structure as provided for in the feasibility study is also by way of table, but it follows a different format to that which you provide in your analysis. Can you explain to the Chair, with reference to the table in the feasibility study, what the difference is in comparison to your analysis as appears in your report?
Yeah, so they have the milking cows and pregnant cows, which is assumed to be the lactating cows in my table. Then in number 3, or line number 3, they've got a dry, and I assume that's dry cows and heifers above 12 months, which is in year 10, which already is a problem for future production. And then the heifers, which is not in milk, lines 4, 5, 6, and 7. And that would be your, in my table on page 19, that would be your followers, the heifers, 3 weeks before calving and so forth. What they don't take into account is the total herd size in the end.
So if please
apologies, Councillor, especially the dry cows, in terms of that, which, you know, if you will see, you have, if you have 500 cows in milk, you have more or less 90 cows, dry cows, In their scenario, there's none.
Yes, and in the feasibility study, there are, however, 3 columns provided, being the first year, the second year, and the third year. And if I can take, for example, item number 4, which is heifers 6 to 12 months. In the first year, the composition they have is 40. In your table at page 19, the number that you have is 120. So how is one to read the 2 tables in consideration of the 3 years and the different numbers provided throughout those years?
Chair, so in my table, that should be a optimal structure for every year. In the table in the feasibility study, you would see that the heifers 6 to 12 months is 40 plus 120. So it's assumed that they buy in heifers, 120 heifers in year 2. And then in year 3, it's assumed that they buy another 170 in at that stage. So they have a building structure, while if you look at the structure that's proposed, the optimal one would be an annual structure that needs to be tried to be attained.
Yes, and you do deal with the issue relating to obtaining cows or purchasing cows in later parts of your report. But just still on the herd structure, what is the importance of a herd structure in a dairy farm?
Chair, yeah, a herd structure or a proper herd structure is very important for your continuous production, which also means continuous cash flow and income. Certain parts and certain farmers, especially when they farm, they produce from pastures, they follow the pasture growing season, so they have a more seasonal production system, which is a different herd structure. In this scenario, and all high-felt farmers that's on feed or intensive dairy, you need to have a continuous daily production to ensure your feasibility or your continuous cash flow and so on. It's also very important if you include that into a processing facility, because processing plants need a continuous supply of milk as well. So you need to have a proper herd structure to ensure that production flow.
And what is your comment in respect of the herd structure as set out in the feasibility study?
Chair, I think what I've said is if you've compared the optimal herd structure with the one that's proposed, there is definitely substantial differences in the number of animals in the specific herd. So that will obviously in the end have an impact on the production flow in this specific project. It's important if you have to note also, if you have 500 cows in milk, it implies that you have 1,050 animals on your farm, which obviously will have an impact on your feeding regime and your feeding costs as well.
Yes. And we have heard evidence that at least 100 cows died. This would obviously have a huge impact on the herd structure. Never mind the optimal herd structure that you've provided, but even on the numbers provided in the feasibility study.
Chair, yeah, the death of 100 cows on any dairy farm will have major consequences in terms of production, income, and so forth. So yeah, it will definitely have a major impact on your structure and your income.
And the herd structure as provided in the feasibility study, whether correct or not, would become quite unattainable given the number of cows that are said to have died.
True, Chair, yeah.
Then the second aspect that you deal with in the feasibility study is the site selection for the dairy buildings. And you do so from page 19 to 20 of your report. And chapter 2, relative to site selection for the dairy buildings, appears from page 61 of the feasibility study. Can you take the chair through your finding in this respect?
Chair, yes. While I was reviewing Chapter 2 in this case of the feasibility study, my comments on that specific chapter is with regards to the resources for site evaluation. Water is one of the major considerations when establishing a dairy. You have to have continuous supply of good quality clean water because it's important for the cows, first of all, as a way of drinking water, but also for cooling them down. And secondly, also it's important for cleaning the dairy equipment for hygienic reasons. Unfortunately, in the feasibility study, there was no clear indication of the source of water that's going to be used in the dairy project.
Wasn't that one of the fundamental flaws in the feasibility study?
Chair, that's correct, and I've made one in some of my final comments. I refer back to the water issue as well. But yes, that is one of the major flaws in the feasibility study.
Because for any business, if you explore the possibility, if you are exploring the possibility of going into that business, one of the things you ask yourself is, what are the essentials that I need for this business? What are the basic requirements? And if you are going to have cattle, you must think about water, you must think about, well, initially maybe grass, but if there's not enough grass, what will the cost implications of cattle feed would be. Where will you get it from? How much will it cost you to bring it to the farm? How much of that will you need? How much will you be spending on cattle feed as opposed to what you will be gaining through selling the milk or milk products that you'll get out of that? That's something very basic that you would do.
Definitely, Chair. Yeah, feeding is one thing. You can still buy in and truck in feed. With water, it's another issue. But yeah, I agree with you. That should be one of your first considerations.
Yes.
In fact, the feasibility study sets out as much. If I can direct you to page 61 of the paginated bundle. The last paragraph where there are 4 enlisted items, it starts there saying essential site factors, and it says there potential sites should be eliminated if they cannot provide these 4 essential factors. The first is water, and it is stated there that a year-round supply of potable water is essential for watering animals and sanitation. Water is also needed for fire protection and cooling cows and milk. Between 200 to 250 liters of fresh water per cow are needed daily for lactating cow consumption and milking. And I can't see what that word is, but then at the end I think it says cleaning. But just on the feasibility study itself, the site would have to be eliminated if it doesn't provide doesn't consider water as an important factor.
That's true, Chair. As we've said, water is a crucial part of any dairy establishment. But it's one thing, and it's a very academic paragraph here, but I don't tell you what the source of the water will be.
Yes,
and if the availability is there year around.
Yes, yeah. That's what I was going to come to say. They state the requirement, but when they do the study, because they are supposed at the end of the document to be able to say, based on this and that, this project or this business is feasible. Now, if they don't address that, what must we make out of what must we make out of that failure on their part?
Chair,
and what value does it mean this study has?
Chair, I think this feasibility study didn't have any value. I think it was an exercise done just for the sake of doing one. Although, as I've said in my initial comment, it's very academic with a lot of jargon in there, and actually doesn't contribute to the overall evaluation of the project.
But it's quite worrying because you ask yourself the question from the department side, who do they go to get this? And then from the point of view who did it, what type of people did he or she think she was doing it for who wouldn't see these things?
Chair, unfortunately, I can't answer that, but I agree with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And the next item that you considered in respect of the site selection for the dairy buildings would be the other considerations that are set out in the feasibility study. What was your finding in that respect?
Chair, one comment on that. The other considerations, as I've mentioned, it's a very academic exercise. They spoke about snow control, and in my view, snow control in Vrede is definitely not one of the biggest considerations when doing a site selection. Yes, we may have some time to time snow there, but it's definitely not going to be a problem in that specific case. So it seems to me that there was a copy and paste from other documents, perhaps from Europe, where snow might be a problem, but definitely not in South Africa.
And do you have any other comment in respect of the other considerations as provided for in the feasibility study?
Not on that specific chapter in terms of the site selection or the site selection. I don't have more comments on that, Chair.
Yes. The next aspect you deal with is the types of buildings, and that is set out at page 63 of the feasibility study, where several types of buildings are provided from that page all the way to page 65. Can you tell the Chair of your view in respect of the types of buildings as identified?
Chair, looking at a feasibility study, it seems as if all the buildings that needs to be there has been noted, at least it was noted. In terms of the sizes that needs to be covered and so forth, I would recommend, or my recommendation was that you get the experience or the input of an agricultural engineer who have more knowledge about the size and type of buildings. But from a glance, all that needs to be there is included in the feasibility study.
Yes. The next aspect you deal with appears from page 66 of that feasibility study, and it deals with the purchase procedure of cows. And you state again that this is an academic exercise. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And why do you say that?
Why I'm saying that is, when you do a feasibility study, you would rather look at the type of cows, the costing, where it should be sourced, and so forth, and not how it's being done. In the feasibility study, there was no indication of when it will be bought, what type of cows would be sourced. And they've noted, one of their comments was they will buy stud stud breeding. Well, they actually noted pedigreed. All animals should be pedigreed. My comment on that was it's not necessarily the case in a commercial herd, except if you do stud breeding for commercial farmers, then you can pedigree the animals. Otherwise, it's a waste of money and time to pedigree a whole commercial herd.
And are you able to briefly inform or advise the Chair on what would be the procedure for purchasing cows?
Chair, you will source cows preferably from the same region where you intend to milk them, because if you buy animals from other parts of the country, let's say, for example, you buy cows in milk from the pasture-based systems in the Eastern Cape and you transport them to the Highveld area, there is definitely going to be stress on that cow. Production will fall immediately, and there will definitely be a time for her to adapt to the new conditions. In the worst case, those cows never adapt to the new conditions because of, the intestines that couldn't adapt and so on, depending on the age of the cow, obviously. So you will preferably source from within your own region or conditions similar to your own region. That would be your first point of call. Secondly, you will look at cows that's affordable, but is still commercially viable in terms of milking, milk production and so on. So I think that's the two major important points for sourcing cows.
And based on the feasibility study and what is provided, as they state the procedure for purchasing cows, is there anything that is of use in that respect?
Chair, nothing at this stage that's usable in terms of that.
Then the next chapter you deal with is the milking parlor, and that appears at page 69 of the feasibility study.
That's correct.
And you state...
69, I think.
69.
Yeah,
Yes,
69.
Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, I'm indebted. You then start your discussion at page 20 of your report. Start your analysis, please, by explaining the different types of milking parlors as set out in the feasibility study.
So, Chair, it's a very short chapter. It's only those couple of paragraphs on page 69. So you have a static parlor, which is a parlor where cows come into the parlor. They're standing still. You can either have a fishbone system where they stand like in a fishbone to each other, in relation to each other. You have a milking pit in the middle where the laborers will connect the teats to the cow. Your second option would be a rotary parlor, which is a big round table. The cows move onto the rotary system. Laborers attach the teats, and it turns around, and as soon as the cow is finished milking, it would get off automatically. And then you've got robotic parlors, which is actually a robot that's standing in the field, and the cows come to the robot to get milk. They walk in, and the teats are automatically attached to the cow. The last one, I don't think there's any example in South Africa of a robotic parlor. It's used in Europe in instances. So there's a layout of the 3 different systems that's being envisaged, but there's no comparison given between the benefits, the costs, or anything between the 3 systems.
And on the study still on page 69, where those 3 systems are set out, are you able to tell which of the 3 systems are preferred in the feasibility study? Just on that chapter that deals with the 3 types of milking parlors as provided.
Yeah, I think the preferred system would be the rotary parlor, given the size of the envisaged dairy project.
But do you say that in your view, or do you say that just in consideration of what the feasibility study provides for?
No, that's my view, Chair. There's nothing in the, Chair, the last sentence. Details of the rotary parlor are attached. So it's assumed then that they would go for the rotary parlor, although those details was not available in the document.
Yes.
Apologies.
And can you just clarify again which of the 3 do you say is preferable for a dairy farm?
The rotary parlor.
Is there anything else of use insofar as the systems provided for in the milking parlor?
No, Chair.
Then in chapter 6, as appears on page 70 of the feasibility study, The next topic that is addressed is the dairy equipments. And you deal with that very briefly in your report. Can you take the chair through these equipments? And in doing so, please confirm whether these are the types of equipments that could be of use in a dairy farm.
Chair, yes, there's a short list of only 11 dairy equipments. So it's milk canes, it's a mixer wagon, cubicles, mattresses, alley mats, cow housing, fans, that's fans, cow brushes, a somatic cell counter, an auto food bath, calf feeders, and calf pen mats. So all of those are applicable in a dairy. Although, you know, I think there's a longer list that should be added to that as well. Some of those, in terms of the mattresses, for example, I think it's not a necessity. It's actually a luxury in a milking environment of this project size.
And the number 500 appears next to mattresses. Would that be the number of mattresses required?
Chair, I assume that would be the number of mattresses, although it's not clear from those listings that it would be that. But I assume that, yeah.
And from the listing, were you able to establish what the estimated costs would be?
Chair, not at all. There was no prizes given. There's no comparable quotes supplied, which would have been, one would have expected in a feasibility study to see those costs and comparable quotes to compare to each other. But in this case, in this scenario, it was not the case.
So the reference to 500 mattresses is based on a 500 milk cow project. Is that right?
Chair, that's the assumption, yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So if in the end they were looking at 1,000, it means they would have made provision for 500 on milk cows only in terms of mattresses and made no provision for the other 500.
Or the other 500, yes, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. The next items that you deal with relate to the reproduction unit, which is set out in Chapter 7 of the feasibility study at page 70, as well as the establishment of a clinical unit, which appears overleaf at page 71. Can you take the chair through your findings, starting with what these units entail?
Chair, yeah, so a production unit or a reproduction unit would be a unit where you do artificial insemination on the cows, you treat sick animals and so forth, and that's normally what we call hospital camps. And then the clinical unit would also take part of that or be part of that, although it can be include other aspects of dairy as well. For example, doing testing on milk and so forth. In my view, both the reproduction and the clinical unit, well, first of all, it can either be combined because they do the same, or they have the same function. But secondly, given the costs involved in establishing those type of units, I think it's unnecessary because you can source those services from the veterinarians, and that's actually normal procedures for dairy farmers in South Africa to have veterinarians assisting them and providing these services to the dairies.
Yes, and in respect of both the reproduction unit and the establishment of a clinical unit, which you say could be combined, there are several units, or rather equipment, enlisted under each unit. Can you take the chair through the equipments that are listed in each unit and give a comment on whether the equipment listed there could be provided in one unit which would be made up of the reproduction unit and clinical unit, as you have found?
Yeah, so I'm not a veterinarian, so I don't have good knowledge of all of them, but most of the equipment is listed as a deep freeze, liquid nitrogen containers, freeze, ultrasound system, a digital thermometer, artificial insemination guns, a computer with a printer, and so forth, the Stosia set, microscopes, and other instruments. That's in the reproduction unit. While in the clinical unit, they also have a deep freeze, a freeze, ultrasound set, HPLC, microscope, operation set, the Stosia set, computer, blood analyzer, hoof trimmer, glucose meter, pyrogen-free water distillation plant, and other miscellaneous equipment. So you will see there's a lot of duplication between the two. So what's being used in one can also be used in the other unit. For example, the deep freeze, the computer, and so on. So I think, yeah, it's all applicable to these units, but it's not necessarily or a necessity on this size of dairy farm.
And given the costs that may become involved in the establishment and running of these units, would you then say that veterinary services would be preferable over the in-housing of reproduction units and the establishment of a clinical unit?
Yes, yeah, given the costs involved or possible cost, it would be preferable to use veterinarian services to the dairy industry to provide these services.
The next item that you then deal with is what you have entitled green fodder production, and that appears at page 71 of the feasibility study, and it is enlisted as Chapter 9.
That's correct, Chair.
Can you firstly explain what that chapter deals with insofar as the equipment enlisted and the seasons referred to?
Chair, yeah, so that chapter or deals with the fodder production. That means your feed production on farm. And in this scenario, they mentioned maize, soybeans in terms of grain, but also maize silage and green maize. So the chapter goes on about all the equipment needed in green fodder production, but no costings is provided in terms of that. They've also made mentions of a summer and a rainy season, as on page 71, and then a winter season on page 72, which will then include your lucerne oats and lucerne hay.
Yes, you then address yourself to the replacement plan that you seem to suggest would be applicable in this chapter. Can you please explain that to the Chair?
Chair, as I've said, there is no costing and a lot of academic jargon. I think all of the equipment listed there it seems very comprehensive, although the replacement of that, how it's going to be replaced and at what stage, the operating costs, and also actually the buy-in cost or the buy-in cost doesn't appear in that chapter. So there's no details to make a good comparison from.
You then address yourself to the agricultural, chemical, fertilizer, and seed, and there you seem to make criticism to what is contained in the feasibility study in that respect.
Yeah, I've looked at the feasibility study, and they've estimated the output of 6 tons per hectare for maize at the cost of 7,612 rand per hectare. So that's an input cost. So I've compared that with the Grain SA numbers for production for the 2012-2013 year. So the production cost for that part of the country for conventional maize was at that stage 9,880 rand and 22 cents per hectare, with an output of 5.5 tons per hectare. So the project seems to be a bit under budgeted for maize production, although at the same level of yield. But if we look at the soybean production, it's the opposite. They estimated 4,526 rand per hectare, while the costing at that stage was 3,896 rand per hectare. The output is comparable at 2 tons per hectare, so it seems to be that there's a bit of over budgeting in terms of the production cost for soybeans. So I think if you compare the two, it should be in line.
Yes, then if we turn to page 98 of the paginated bundle, there appears a topic entitled Chapter 10, Fodder Preservation / Fodder Bank. I note in your report that you have not dealt with this aspect, but I see from the feasibility study that it is stated there that preservation can be done by 2 methods. The first is hay and the second is silage. Are you able to comment on those 2 preservation methods insofar as their correctness? And secondly, what would be most appropriate for a dairy farm?
Chair, yeah, in terms of the most appropriateness, both of them, because one, the hay would be a fodder requirement in terms of roughage for the cow, while silage is an energy component of feed. So both of them will be applicable. I haven't specifically made any comments on that because the feasibility study is very academic, so it doesn't fit for me into a proper feasibility study.
Yes, then the third last chapter is on pasture development, which appears on page 102 of the feasibility study, which you have dealt with. What were your findings insofar as the pasture development?
Yeah, pasture development, it's actually strange to have pasture development on the high veld because they feed from a total mixtration, first of all. Secondly, again, very academic, but I think what was my comment on that one is there was again a discrepancy in the numbers because they spoke about possible pasture forage systems for 250 cows in milk dairy module. So, you know, one can wonder, is they only going to use that for 250 and the other 250 cows or 750 would be TMR, but it's definitely not clear and a discrepancy in terms of the numbers.
Yes,
well, can I take you back to that paragraph on hay at page 98? Hay is one form of conserved feed that can be fed to farm animals when other forms of forage are in short supply. Hay is made from pastures during the summer months. Certain grass crops are grown specifically for hay conservation purposes, whereas grazed pastures could be mown for hay. Should there be surplus growth, hay can also be made from cowpeas and soybeans. Is that a good example of what you're talking about when you say this document is very academic? Because if you're doing a feasibility study for somebody who wants to run this kind of project, you have to assume that they know what hay is. Must you tell them what hay is?
Chair, I don't think it's necessary to tell them what hay is. If they don't know what hay is, they shouldn't be in business.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like taken from some
It's like taking from a textbook. And
some textbook.
Yeah.
Because all that the person would be looking at, will it be feasible to run this kind of business in this area? Where would I, what costs would be involved? What logistics would be required? Will I have everything that I need to have to run a successful business?
I agree with you, Chair. I would have expected to see that there's a line item for hay and telling me hay production will be this amount of money. It will feed you this number of cows and so on. Yeah.
Yes.
But
something that would tell you on this farm, these are your chances of having adequate hay. Or if you don't have hay from this farm, this is where you can find it. This is what it will cost you if you are going to rely on hay.
Definitely, Chair.
Yeah. Okay.
And you earlier said that in respect of the entire chapter, you found it to be quite academic. I would understand that to also apply to silage, as is set out from page 100.
That's correct, Chair.
Thank you. You were still telling the Chair of your findings in respect of the pasture development, as appears from page 102 of the feasibility study.
Chair, yeah, that was my comment on that was they spoke about 250 cows, which again is quite different from the 500 versus the 1,000 cows in milk. So it seems, as we said, it seems as if this is a copy and paste from somewhere, a textbook into this document.
And quite a bad job at that.
That's also true, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, the last chapter that is dealt with in the feasibility study appears at page 108.
That's correct, Chair.
And it relates to animal nutrition. That is chapter 12.
Yes.
And you deal with that in page 20 of your report.
That's correct, Chair.
And you do so by starting with feeding formulas as provided in this chapter. Can you please take the Chair through that?
Chair, yes, there's a couple of feeding formulas that's being included in this chapter. My comment on that was you need to have an animal nutritionist to evaluate these formulas and to comment on the cost of the formula versus the production potential. Because dairy feeding is quite a specialist type of feeding or feeding system. So as an agricultural economist, it's difficult for me to make a proper comments on the formulas as such.
And are you able to comment on how frequent an animal nutritionist would have to be at a dairy farm?
Chair, preferably at least once a month to check if everything is fine. Production are in, at the preferred level, and then if something changes, as soon as possible thereafter.
Yes. Then the next aspect you deal with was the water requirement of the cattle. And what is your view in that respect?
Chair, yes, I would like to refer you to table 112, page 112. There's a table regarding the water requirements. And if I can speak to that table.
Yes, please, go ahead.
They speak about, or they give the different number of cows, the drinking requirements, and the number of animals in the second year, and then the total required liters. So if I did the calculations, and that's drinking water requirements liters per day. For example, line 1, 3 to 6 month old cows, 10 liters per day. There's 120 animals, so it's 1,200 liters per day. They give a total number of 88,200. That's only per day. If you multiply that by 365, you get to a number of 32.2 million liters, which is quite substantial difference from the 88. So if you make your assumptions and your calculations on only 88,000 litres, you would definitely run into trouble in terms of dairy production just from the water side.
And you have said that much in your report.
That's correct, Chair, yeah.
So, so does that mean that where they are supposed to have had about 32 million litres, they have got 88,000?
Yeah, yes, Chair. They've noted 88,200 litres total required.
Yeah.
But
When
that's
in
actually
fact-
that's for one day.
Yes.
So it's actually in fact it should be 32.2 million litres.
So they got it that wrong.
Yes, Chair. And
So
that's
the on the calculation, the total required of litres was 32 million, but they said 88,000.
yes, Chair. And that's a substantial error.
If we consider that table on page 112, is there any way that it could be understood to be a sum total for the litres of water required per day?
If you only look at the first column, Chair, it says litre per day, but if you say total requirement litres, you would assume it as to be the total number. So either the table is very unclear, or there's a mistake in drawing it up. I would have liked to see another column there perhaps included as your total requirement per annum, which would be your 32 million litres.
Yes, and perhaps it might be more useful
It
to
definitely-
have a number for the amount of litres required per annum.
It would definitely be more useful since all the other calculations is per annum and not per day.
Then at the bottom of that page, page 112, there appears an item enlisted as workshop equipment, which you have not dealt with in your report. And there is a list of tools and equipment that are required for a workshop. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
Are you able to comment on the appropriateness of the equipment enlisted there?
Chair, no, I think it's very appropriate that, or very appropriate equipment, especially in terms of if you take into account they want to produce maize and soybeans and so on. So yeah, no, those equipment is clear or is necessary. Although I would have liked to see prices and costing to that.
Yes. Then the next topic that the feasibility deals with is the economic impact for the local community and province. And that appears from page 113 of the study.
Ms. Molefe, we are at about, 6 minutes past 4. I know that you had estimated 2 hours. I'm not saying that you said that was the exact amount of time required. That was an estimate. But what's your estimate of how much more time?
We are almost at the end of Mr. Maria's evidence. I think about 30 minutes at most should suffice to complete his evidence.
Okay, so
if the chair permits.
So it will end up being 2 hours, 45 minutes.
Well, I honestly haven't been keeping track, Chair, but I do accept that.
No, it's fine. Let's continue. Is it still fine with you, Mr. Fori, if we continue for the next 30 minutes to try and finish?
Yes, Chair, fine with me.
Yes, okay, thank you.
I'm highly indebted,
Let's
Chair.
proceed, okay.
Thank you. Mr. Maria, can you please turn to page 113? And as stated there, they deal with the economic impact for the local community and the province. And the impact or the number of cows considered under that impact is 500. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And what was your view insofar as what is said to be the economic impact as set out on that page?
Chair, I've noted my comments on page 21 of my report, and in the first paragraph, they've said, that local producers of equipment and other services will be benefiting from the project. As I've mentioned earlier as well, a lot of equipment is being imported, especially if it's high precision operations or equipment that's being required. So my comment on that is that the local economy would not benefit or get a benefit of all the procurement of equipment as noted.
Yes. You then also deal with the figures that are quoted, and you also deal with the initial assumptions in that respect.
That's correct, Chair. They've quoted a number of figures. First of all, on page 113, the first bullet point, they've said that the dairy will generate at least 320 million in gross revenue over the next 6 years. That's from the assumption that they produce 45 litres per cow per day, which in my earlier comments is not realistic. So all these numbers will then need to be adapted to more realistic figures if they make it on that initial assumptions.
But also, wouldn't you expect some more motivation of how that figure is arrived at, or do they provide motivation elsewhere?
Chair, they do provide a financial performance and a table on the very last page, page 120. So there is some figures, although it's very difficult to read.
Yes.
So there is some figures there.
That we can deal with later on.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Murray, evidence has been given that the machinery that was imported was not brand new machinery on observation, but was actually second-hand machinery. Are you able to give a view on what the impact would be on the costing that is provided as appears on page 113?
Chair, I think if it's second-hand machinery, it will definitely cost substantially less than new machinery. Difficult to say the exact numbers, but there's no reason to pay the same price for second-hand imported machinery than for brand new ones.
Yes. Then you also deal with the outline of the costs and purchasing procedure, which you address yourself to at page 21 of your report.
Chair, yes, I've said a more comprehensive outline is required, and definitely also the purchasing procedure to do a proper farm-level cost analysis or impact on that. There's no indication of preferential local procurement, so it's inconclusive that the local economy will benefit 100% from this type of project.
Yes, and you've also earlier mentioned that the intended milk production output is also problematic, and that would also, as I understand it, have an effect on that aspect that deals with the local economy said to benefit or receive 100% of the benefits.
That's correct, Chair, yeah.
Then the next item that appears there is the financial implications of the project, and the discussion is commenced firstly with the land itself, which you have given your view on.
Chair, yes, as mentioned in my comments, it seems from the documents that the land has already been acquired for this project, but no mention is made of existing operations on that specific land. If any operations currently exist on that land, it's definitely necessary to know what that entails, because that will have an impact on your business plan and your feasibility study.
And you also deal with the cows that are said to be donated or intended to be donated to the community, as well as the milk that would be produced from these cows. What was your finding in that respect?
Chair, yeah, the comment or the paragraph is on page 114. My comment on that was that 500 cows are intended to be donated to the community, with the milk then the milk produced from that will then be bought back by the specific project by Estina in the form of a share milking agreement. But there's no mention made of any contracts that's being put in place with regards to share milking and what the terms of those agreements will be, because that will have a significant effect on your feasibility study as well.
Just so that we can get this out of the way, the notes made on the study by hand, is that your handwriting?
Chair, that's correct. That's my handwriting, yes.
Okay, all right. And the reference in that paragraph at 114, the last paragraph under industry analysis, the reference to 1,500 hectares there, is that consistent? Wasn't the farm to be about 3,000?
Chair,
or was it acres as opposed to hectares, 3,000 something?
Chair, if my memory don't leave me, I think the initial number was 4,500 hectares.
Yes.
And then there's, I think the 1,000. I think in my previous comments, there's mention made of the arable land, the pastures, and veld and so on. But if I'm correct, the total size of the farm is 4,500 hectares.
Yes.
If I may assist, Chair,
Yes,
the total is 4,400.
Sorry?
4,400.
That was the
total
size of the farm.
hectares. Yes, Chair.
Yes. And so this 1,500, is that anything similar to the 500 milk cows and 1,000 milk cows? Is that the same kind of inconsistency?
Chair, I'll check for you. If I remember correctly, it's consistent with the arable land, the 1,500 hectares.
But is that paragraph referring to arable land? Or it talks about sufficient grains?
That's correct, Chair.
Oh, okay. So it would be consistent where if one talks about farming being in relation to arable land.
That's
Okay.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Maria, can I refer you, please, to page 34 of the bundle, and that document or that page relates to the project proposal.
That's correct.
If you refer to the bottom of that page, there appears a table which you have given evidence on, and you have addressed yourself to the employment opportunities as outlined in this table, which was said to be in the sum of 600.
That's correct.
You've previously told the Chair that in your view, 50 would have sufficed. At the very top of that table, the first item that appears there is total area available for project operations, and that amount given is in hectares. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And the amount is 4,450.
Correct.
The next line item is natural veld grazing, and the hectares provided is 3,100.
Correct.
Following that is arable area, which is 1,350.
Correct.
And the next item is irrigable area, which is 1,000 hectares.
Yeah, that's correct.
Are you able to assist with the total area that is said to be available for project operations if you consider the sum of the three line items that follow, being in the amount of 3,100, 1,350, and 1,000? On my basic calculation, it amounts to more than 4,450.
That's correct, yeah. The total area available is actually only the two lines, the natural veld and the arable land. My calculation as well, that 1,000 hectares shouldn't be in there. as irrigable land. Because then you get to a total amount of 5,450.
Yes. Can we then return to the feasibility study?
Well, before you return, what about the fact that at page 34, the arable land is given as, is it 1,350 hectares? Is that right?
That's correct, Chair.
But then on this document at page 114, you were saying that, well, 1,500 hectares on that paragraph would be consistent if that's a reference to arable land. Doesn't the information that is at 34 about arable land then suggest that there is some inconsistency?
Yes, Chair. No, definitely. Then that 1,500 should actually be 1,350.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Murray, if we then move to the next item in the feasibility study, which relates to the business experience of partners / directors / key persons, and I am on page 114 of the feasibility study. Several persons are listed from page 114 to 115, is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And these persons are listed as key to this project, is that correct?
That's correct.
From your reading at page 115 of the profiles of these persons, and perhaps I'll ask you to take the chair through the profiles of the 3 persons that are enlisted on page 115, I'm going to request you to comment on whether their profiles relate to South African agriculture, and if not, what the impact would be.
Chair, from what I read from that page on page 115, I don't see any expertise on South African conditions, rather Indian and other types of conditions.
Perhaps sorry to interject, Mr. Murray,
problem.
can you just briefly take the chair through those profiles, starting with the first person, who is Mr. C.P. Yadav, as I have it, and just briefly take the chair through what his expertise is said to be, and in what country or continent, followed by the other 2.
Chair, Mr. Yadav, C.P. Yadav, he's noted as the head of the project. He's an ex-Indian Administrative Service Officer, served in several key administrative positions in the government of India. But it's not limited to the Agricultural Production Commissioner. Well, it's including that, but not limited to. There was a CV enclosed which I wasn't privy to. The second person was Dr. R.J. Sharma. He's a recognized technocrat in the field of agriculture and allied activities, ex-dean of the College of Veterinary and Animal Sciences at a specific university at Pantnagar, seems to be. So I think that in terms of his expertise, there's various research aspects of dairy and draft animals, poultry, rabbitry, piggery, and so on. So I think his expertise in terms of animals would be sufficient, because a cow is more or less a cow everywhere, although the local conditions may differ. The third person is a certain Mr. P.E. Yadav. He's got an MSc Ag in agronomy, also from Pant University and of Agriculture and Technology. He's very young and energetic, and I don't think, 5 years of experience in agronomy and horticulture.
But, well, I don't see their CVs, although it said their CVs attached. But from what one sees here at page 115, one doesn't get the impression that these are people who have a lot of operational experience. It's like research people's academics. Is that the same impression you have as well?
That's my impression as well, Chair. There's administrative and
administrative
and research capabilities.
Yeah.
And my comment,
Yes.
handwritten comment there is, where's the local expertise?
Yes.
Which is not mentioned in,
Yes.
in this.
Yes, that doesn't seem to be an indication of
Yeah.
somebody really involved in operations of this type of business. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Maria, just for completeness sake, there's reference to CVs being enclosed. Have you ever had sight of CVs of any of these persons?
Chair, no, I haven't had sight of any of the CVs.
Then can
Did
we,
you, by any chance, ask the department whether they had the CVs, or they were simply not attached to you, to the feasibility study?
Chair, the documents I received from ENS was
and
only
not-
these documents, so
Yes.
I haven't asked them even
Yes.
for those CVs.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Then if we turn to page 116 of the feasibility study, you address yourself to the breakdown of the project costing of the dairy unit, and you do so at the bottom of page 21 of your report and overleaf at page 22. Starting with irrigation and mechanization, can you tell the Chair of what your review and finding is in that respect?
Chair, yes, there's two amounts mentioned there. For irrigation and mechanization, 45 million, and for rain-fed mechanization, 32 million. It seems to be reasonable if, on the condition, if you look at the irrigation part, on condition that the water is available. The rain-fed mechanization is unreasonable in my view, since a large portion of that cost will be covered under the irrigation cost. You use the same tractor when you do planting under irrigation than you do on rain-fed or dry land conditions. So it's actually a double counting for me in a sense.
So in respect of the amount of 45 million, what would your opinion be on the appropriateness of that amount insofar as both irrigation and mechanization, as well as the rain-fed mechanization?
Jenna, the two amounts is definitely unreasonable high. I would rather go to, or prefer to have only the rain-fed mechanization. 32 million would be more reasonable for this size of operation.
When you say 32 million would be more than reasonable, is it in respect of both those items?
Both the items, Chair.
Yes.
It's for grain production in general.
Then the next line item that appears there is dairy cattle, and it's specific to cows and milk.
That's correct, Chair.
And it is specified as 25,000 per cow, and you have already told the Chair that on your estimate, 15,000 per cow would suffice.
That's correct, Chair.
The next item that follows is also dairy cattle, and it says there rest of herd, and it also says there that it would be 25,000 per cow.
That's correct, Chair.
And your finding is that this is unreasonable, which you stated earlier to the Chair. And again, you make reference to an amount of 13,000 per heifer being appropriate.
That's correct, Chair.
The item that then follows is bulk cooling tanks, which are provided at an approximate amount of 25,500,000. What was your comment in that respect?
Chair, I've made 3 comments on that. Firstly, if you take into account, and let's say you work from a 45 litre per cow per day estimate, then the dairy for 500 cows will produce 22,500 litres per day. A more reasonable assumption would be at 35 litres per day, which result in the dairy producing 17,500 litres per day. So if you take that production into account, that would require a bulk tank or a bulk tank of more or less double the daily production. So let's say 30,000 litres. If you take the 500 cows times 35 litres per day. So if the project buy two 30,000 litres tanks, because they want to expand to 1,000 cows in milk, it would cost them roughly 2.5 million in total. So a budgeted amount of 25.5 million is unreasonably high. It's 10 times the actual requirement.
Yes, then the next item that you deal with is the dairy products manufacturing plant and pasteurizer, and that has been estimated at 14 million and 60 million respectively. You've earlier dealt with this aspect. Can you just summarize what your finding was in that respect?
Chair, just to confirm, I would include those two lines in the dairy manufacturing plant or the dairy manufacturing cost and not on the dairy farm costing.
Yes, the next item is the animal feed plant and grain and oil seed mill, which is said to be 29 million rands in total. What was your finding on the reasonableness of that amount?
Chair, I also found that to be unreasonable since the feasibility study doesn't make it clear which production system will be used. It's difficult then to give an opinion, if it's applicable or not. But I think in this scenario, it's definitely not applicable after taking everything into account.
Yes. You then deal with the breakdown of the project costing for the dairy processing plant, as appears on page 60, which is at paginated page 117. And the first item is the UHT long life milk plant, which you earlier spoke to, estimated at 149 million rands. And you had earlier said that this amount is unreasonable. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And what, in your opinion, would be a reasonable amount?
Chair, a plant, a UHT plant that can process 120,000 litres per day, at that stage, 2013, would have cost you more or less 65 million rand, excluding the building. The 149 million is therefore very, very high.
It's more than double, is it?
That's correct, Chair.
Yes. Then the next item is the dairy products manufacturing, which you've also dealt with, and that is estimated at 46 million rands. And you again make reference to provision for equipment having already been made. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
So what would be the effect in your analysis?
Chair, I think it's definitely double budgeting, so it's in both sides, and therefore the cost is inflated a lot.
Yes. Then the last line item there is working capital, which is estimated at 5 million rands. On your previous appearance at the Commission, you stated that the number of 50 employees would suffice for the dairy project. Is that correct?
Yeah, the 50 employees would only be for a dairy farm.
Yes.
This is not the working capital for the processing plant, yes.
Yes. And what is your finding in that respect?
Chair, I think that 5 million working capital on a dairy processing plant is actually on the low side in terms of all the running costs at the processing plant.
And
What would you consider to be a realistic amount?
Chair, I think a more realistic amount would be more in the region of 15 million running cost or working capital.
Okay.
Then the second last line item that you deal with is the financial performance as provided for in the feasibility study. And you deal with that at page 22 of your statement. And you had earlier stated, as with reference to the feasibility study, that there would be a loss of about 8.4 million in the first year for the years 2012 and 2013, and another loss for about 1.84 million for the years 2013 and 2014. Do I have that correctly?
That's correct, Chair.
What was your finding insofar as the financial performance as set out in the feasibility study?
Chair, if you look at the financial performance, and I had to rely on the documents that was given to me, so that's the profit and loss statement on page 120, paginated. So if you look at that, there's not enough detail to draw sensible conclusions for either the dairy farm or the processing plant. I think first of all, the major flaw in all the documents and all the calculations is the 45 litres per cow per day, which is not reasonable.
Well, what about the fact that the whole study is based on uncertainty whether you are dealing with 500 milk cows or 1,000 milk cows? Isn't that also a major flaw to the study, to the feasibility study? Because if you are given this feasibility study, how do you assess whether it's feasible, whether you don't know whether it's based on a project or business that will have 1,000 milk cows or 500 milk cows? So whatever they say, can you really make any realistic decisions, not knowing that?
No, sir, not in this document.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the many flaws in the documents,
Yeah.
is that discrepancy between the numbers and the initial assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me to be such a major flaw. I mean, if somebody said, I'm thinking of introducing a taxi business to take people from Johannesburg to Pretoria, do a study, and then you say, well, you do a study which makes it unclear whether you're talking about 100 taxis or 200 taxis. I mean, it seems to me you can't even begin to do anything until you get that right, because you can't bring 200 taxis when what is viable is only to bring 10 taxis. Otherwise, it's a huge loss.
No, you're 100% correct, Chair.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Then, before I reach the conclusion, Chair, we have in the reference bundle B inserted a better copy of the table that appears at page 120 of the feasibility report. And this we have at page 545 of file reference B.
Just arrange to replace later on
We'll do so, Chair.
this copy with a better one.
Will do, Chair. There's a better copy in the reference bundle. We'll replace also
Yes,
the
but what I
exhibit
say
we're
is
currently dealing with.
This one also,
Indeed,
this bundle must also have a better copy.
We will do so,
Yeah.
Chair. Thank you. Mr. Murray, if we then turn to page 119, being the conclusion of the feasibility study, it is stated there that, and I quote, the following additional factors make a sound business case for the project to succeed. Do you see that?
I see that, Chair.
And just for the record, this feasibility study is dated, if you look at the top, October 2012.
That's correct.
And you might have heard evidence that payment to Estina was made prior to October 2012, at least the first payment. Now, in the conclusion, they state there that there is a large scope for a dairy project in South Africa, as presently the market is controlled by a few companies which are making abnormal profits. In line with the heading or the opening sentence, which say that these additional factors make a sound business case for the project to succeed. Are you able to align that with what is stated there as the first factor?
Chair, I think definitely not. Yes, there is, the dairy industry is controlled by a few companies, and I wouldn't say it's being controlled, but there's a few marketing companies. They're definitely not, at that stage, they were not making abnormal profits. In actual fact, there's quite a number of losses as well. And actually, there was more companies coming into the market in terms of what we call producer distributors. So people distributing their own milk. So I can't relate to that first bullet point.
Then with the second one, B, it says, in South Africa, the land is easily available and agriculture and farming is highly developed and modernized. Cattle farming is more evolved in meat production rather than dairy because the present dairy owners having the monopoly are exploiting the farmers and not giving them the reasonable price for the milk. So in case of any eventuality, the milk can be procured from the local farmers at reasonable prices. And you have dealt with this insofar as the local component and whether there would be favorable purchases in this respect.
Yes, I think there's a couple of problems or flaws in that comment as well. Land is not necessarily easily available. Yes, farming is highly developed and modernized, but in case of there is no milk available, it will definitely not be easily sourced from the local producers in the Vrede area because, as previously stated, there's a huge decline in producers in the Free State.
Yes, then thirdly, it speaks about land having already been acquired for implementing the project as well as the backward integration. Fourthly, it says the company is managed by the professionals and experienced people with long experience in this line of activity, and you've already dealt with both items. Then lastly, it says funding for the project has already been committed to both by the department as well as the promoters. Now, just given the nature of what a feasibility study is supposed to achieve, what would you say to that last line item where they say that funding for the project has already been committed to?
Jay, it's actually very strange to see that in a feasibility study because you would rather do that before funds being committed, so that it definitely doesn't fit in the feasibility study.
Yes. Can we then turn to page 23 of your report? And there you deal with your conclusions and your recommendations. And starting with 3.1, as appears on page 23, can you take the chair through the concerns that you have identified in respect of the documents that you were provided for review?
Jay, yes, I think I've noted all the specific concerns in the body of the report, but then I've noted some other concerns and comments that arise from my review. Firstly, all three of the documents lacked the information that's being required to carry out a proper analysis for the project. Specifically, for example, the information on the detailed costing of equipment and so on. Secondly, the feasibility, as I've said numerously, it was more an academic study than it was a feasibility study. There's a lot of significant amount of jargon in there. In particular, however, the following concerns were raised. The study, first of all, does not indicate with respect to the buildings whether local weather and climatic conditions were taken in consideration. Secondly, the purchasing of the cows, the information on that is very academic, and it doesn't make any mention of the following: what type of cows will be sourced, where the cows will be sourced, and when it will be bought. A further concern arising from that is the availability of cows. because at that stage, in 2013, when I reviewed the proposal or the documents, both cows in milk and pregnant heifers were actually very scarce. Furthermore, established producers buy the cows that become available because they expand to achieve the economies of scale. As I've mentioned earlier as well, it's also not recommended to buy cows from everywhere across the country because it will have an impact on milk production. Then my third comment, equipment and tractors seems to be double counted for. For example, there's provision made for 8 82 kilowatt tractors, although it's not mentioned it's only mentioned once in the documents, but the prices of the specific individual equipments was not mentioned in any of the documents. In terms of irrigation water, because they've made mention of irrigation, there's a lot of academic jargon, but there's, for me, a major concern regarding the availability of water and then also the licensing of the water rights, because we know that's a huge problem. Fifthly, in terms of silage, using a contractor would make more sense. It's being actually recommended since the production cost and the capital outlay to produce silage is much lower when you make use of a contractor, experienced contractor. And that's also the norm in the dairy industry. Number 6, in terms of animal nutrition, the feeding requirements for the different categories of animals differ, and hence my recommendation or comment that the services of an animal nutritionist should be sourced to compile a proper feeding requirement. And then number 7, one crucial point which is also not noted in the feasibility study is possible contingency plans with regards to electricity cost and supply. Now, electricity cost and supply, proper supply is very crucial in a dairy because cows need to be milked more or less at the same time every day. In certain cases, either twice or 3 times a day. Milk needs to be cooled down fairly quickly and it should be kept cooled. So electricity supply is crucial, but nowhere in the documents it was made mention of contingency plan in terms of electricity. At that stage, we know that blackouts or load shedding was very pertinent. So that was a concern for me. In terms of the processing plant, point 3, the following additional comments should also be noted. If the processing plants would rely solely on the own production of this project, it would not be worth the capital outlay as projected in the costing. Even if the production is assumed as in the project to be 22,500 litres per day, a normal batch pasteurizer can be installed for approximate cost of 450,000, which is substantially less than the 60 million that's envisaged. The same applies for the other dairy equipment. The costing is far too high for that as well. In terms of the UHT plant that's been budgeted for in the project proposal, this plant would not be viable for production if the dairy project alone depends on its own production. Research at that stage indicated that the plant that's been able to process 120,000 litres per day, the costing is roughly 65 million. If you add another 30 million for buildings and stores of your UHT milk production, you come to a total of 95 million, which is substantially bigger or substantially lower than the 149 million as they budgeted for. And lastly, given the current trends and realities in the South African dairy sector, it would be more appropriate, investment in the dairy industry would be more appropriate in the coastal areas where conditions for production is more favorable. Investment of this magnitude in the Free State is actually considered too risky and not sustainable.
Yes. And in line with the concerns that you have highlighted to the chair now, you then set out or provided several recommendations in your report. And that, as I have it, appears from page 24 to 25 of your report. Can you please take the chair through the recommendations that you made?
Yes, yeah, in terms of those recommendations, my first recommendation would be to do a detailed cost analysis of this project, which would require more detailed information as was provided in the different documents that was supplied. The unnecessary academic jargon should be removed from the feasibility study. It should be reworked to conform to the principles of a feasibility study. And that would be included or include at least an analysis of the market for both the primary production and the manufacturing level. More clarity is needed on the business model and comparisons to other business models. For the processing unit, a marketing and sales strategy was absent in this one. Little mention is made of the management and personnel requirements and the structure of that. Environmental issues were not addressed in the feasibility study. Critical risk factors were absent and should be included in a feasibility study. And in terms of the financial performance, the feasibility study included an income statement. However, the following financial documents with projections and assumptions should also have been included: a balance sheet, a cash flow statement, and a break-even analysis. And then a time schedule for the project should form part of the feasibility study. The profit and loss income statement should be more detailed, with the primary production and the processing facility being separated as two different, let's call it entities, but two different projects, for example, that would make it easier to make more appropriate comments and benchmarking on the different income statements. And then in terms of the risk associated with this type of project, it is recommended to determine a feasible exit strategy as well. Will there be reasonable chance to recover money invested should a project not come to fruition? And then the market risk for manufactured products should also have been discussed in a feasibility study. So in conclusion, my recommendation is not to continue with the project in its current state, since government will not receive value for money. The costs are not reasonable and or market related.
Thank you. Now, notwithstanding some of the many issues that you've pointed out, including the issues that you've raised around the appropriateness or inappropriateness of the costs that have been quoted in these documents, could the department have come to a reasonable conclusion based on these documents to proceed with this project?
Chair, I don't think they could have come to a reasonable conclusion to continue with the project, given all the flaws and in the different documents. I think a proper administrative person would see that, with financial background and even a bit of agricultural background. They could have seen there's a lot of flaws. So I don't think they could have come to a reasonable conclusion to continue with that.
Are there any circumstances under which you could imagine that a chief financial officer of a government department could approve a project on the basis of the documents that you have dealt with?
Chair, no, I can't think of any reasonable conclusion or things, yeah.
Would that answer also apply to a head of department? Are there any circumstances under which you think a head of a government department could approve a project based on this document?
No, Chair, not even head of a department. I think they should have had more knowledge about projects of this kind, of this nature, to make proper decisions.
And if they didn't know, obviously they needed to get advice from people who are qualified.
Chair,
But this being a Department of Agriculture, one would have expected that the head of department would be knowledgeable on matters that fall under the Department of Agriculture.
Definitely, Chair, and if he doesn't necessarily have the specific industry expertise, there's always, people that know that could have been sourced and give an opinion on that. Yeah, advice on that. Yeah. All state departments can interlink with each other and do that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just a last question for you, Mr. Murray. Sometime last week, we received a statement, Chair, from the former HOD, Mr. Tabete, and he enlists his qualifications firstly as a B Agric degree, which he obtained during 1988. Secondly, he has a B Agric honors, and thirdly, he has an MA degree in development communication. Just on the two B Agric degrees, do you think that it would be reasonable to expect whether he could apply himself firstly to those documents, and thirdly come to a conclusion that would be befitting or beneficial rather to the department?
Chair, I definitely think it's reasonable to think that, yeah.
Thank you. Chair, we have no further questions for Mr. Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murray, for having come to give evidence. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. If there is a need, we will ask you to come back.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, and you are excused.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. What have we got for tomorrow again? Which witnesses have we got?
Chair, we have Mr. Moremi, who will be giving evidence. He is the former municipal manager of the Phumelela municipality.
Yes. Is it him only?
And we may have Mr. Dlamini returning to give additional evidence to that which he has given to the Commission.
Yes, you say may.
Well,
are we going to have, or are we not going to have?
We would like to see the chair in chambers, as earlier indicated, in respect of Mr. Dlamini.
Okay, all right. And are you following up on the outstanding issues relating to Mr. Basson?
Yes, Chair.
Involving members of Parliament and so on?
Yes, Chair, we are following up on that.
Okay, all right. Tomorrow, I think I'm hearing an application for leave to cross-examine before we start with the witness. Sorry. Is that starting at 9:30? Yeah. So I'm starting at 9:30 tomorrow with that application. And then at 10 o'clock, we will then start with the witness, or as soon as possible once I'm done with the application.
Thank you, Chair.
We'll adjourn for today, and we'll start tomorrow at 9:30 with the application, but with the next witness at 10 o'clock. We adjourn.